Okay, let's unpack this. You brought us something really remarkable today, Niccolò Machiavelli's Discourses, specifically the Ninian Hill Thomson translation. He's basically taking ancient Roman history apart, piece by piece.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's like he viewed the Roman Republic as this giant historical experiment. He
Oh,
wasn't just telling stories. He was digging for these, well, universal truths about how states work, how they succeed, and, why they eventually fall apart.
exactly. And the idea here, using your sources, is we can kind of get straight to some really powerful insights about leadership, about people, about how states live and die, all through Machiavelli's, let's be honest, pretty sharp and sometimes uncomfortable lens.
That's the plan. Our
Mhm.
mission is to pull out those key arguments, the things he saw in Rome that he thought applied everywhere, anytime, including his own time and, well, maybe ours too.
And he kicks things off right at the very start, doesn't he? Like, how do cities even begin? What did he find kind of surprising about just founding a state?
Well, first he breaks it down. Are they founded by locals or by outsiders? But then he says something interesting about location. You'd think fertile land is obviously best, right? For growth, defense, feeding people.
Yeah, seems like a no-brainer.
But Machiavelli saw a danger there. He thought that ease, that abundance, could make people uh, listless, effeminate was his word, basically too soft.
A danger in fertile land that feels completely backward.
Right. His point was if life's too easy, people don't develop the grit, the toughness needed for good citizenship or defense. So he observed leaders have to impose laws, create hardships artificially if nature doesn't provide them. Like the Egyptians, he says, despite the fertile Nile, they had strict training. It's about building resilience.
Wow. That just flips the whole script on comfort leading to strength. It sounds like he thinks struggle is almost necessary.
He really does. And it shapes how he ranks historical figures. Who gets the top spot, in his view?
Not necessarily the big conquerors, right? It's the founders and, interestingly, the restorers.
Exactly. Founders of religions, good kingdoms, commonwealths, they get praise. But founders of tyranny, he absolutely condemns them. And he says there's basically no greater path to fame than restoring a state that's gone corrupt. Think Romulus rebuilding Rome, not Caesar destroying a republic.
So saving a corrupt state is actually more glorious than taking over a free one.
Okay.
That's quite a take. And for a new ruler coming in, he had some pretty stark advice.
Oh, yeah. For a new prince taking over a city or province, his advice is basically make everything new.
Everything.
Everything. Get rid of the old guard, the people who benefited before,
Yeah.
because they'll always resist the new order. It's a blunt recognition that power transitions aren't just about swapping leaders. Sometimes you have to dismantle the whole previous structure.
Okay, let's pivot slightly, but stick with foundations. Because Machiavelli's view of human nature is, well, it's probably what he's most famous or infamous for. What's his basic assumption about people?
It's not optimistic. And it really underpins his whole approach to politics. He starts from the idea that all men are bad and will always give loose to their evil whenever they get the slightest chance.
So you can't build a state hoping people will just be good. You got to plan for the worst.
That's exactly it. Laws, institutions, they aren't just guides for good folks. They're fundamentally restraints for inherently self-interested, potentially harmful individuals. You design the system assuming people will try to game it. He does add a nuance, though, saying men seldom know how to be wholly good or wholly bad. So there's complexity.
Okay, so not pure evil, but definitely leaning towards self-interest if unchecked.
That's the default setting, yeah.
And how fast does he think people can go from good to bad if you give them power? He uses that Roman example, the decemvirs.
Oh, incredibly fast. The decemvirate 10 men appointed to write laws for Rome for just 1 year. They turned into absolute tyrants almost overnight. He points particularly to Appius Claudius. For Machiavelli, this was proof positive of how easily men, even supposedly born good and well brought up, can be corrupted by unchecked authority. It's a really stark warning.
And that connects directly to the challenge of keeping a state free, doesn't it? If people are prone to corruption, how hard is it to maintain freedom?
He thinks it's incredibly hard, especially for people who aren't used to it or who are already, corrupted as a society. He points out that if people used to living under a prince, they can barely handle freedom if they suddenly get it. They might even miss their chains, like Brutus's sons wanting the Tarquins back.
Wow.
And worse, a corrupt people. They can basically hardly maintain freedom at all. In a corrupt state, Machiavelli says, laws become useless unless you have some really strong, maybe even violent authority to enforce them and basically reset the whole community.
So corruption isn't just about a few bad apples. It's a societal thing, maybe linked to inequality, that needs drastic measures.
Exactly. He sees deep inequality as a major source of corruption, creating factions that tear the state apart. And he thinks it needs those strong, almost violent remedies to fix. It really undermines the whole idea of gentle, free government once corruption sets in.
Okay, so given this pretty grim view of human nature and corruption, how did Machiavelli see the usual path for governments? He talks about a cycle.
Yeah, he saw this sort of inevitable cycle, almost like a political law of nature. Monarchy decays into tyranny, then the nobles overthrow the tyrant, setting up an aristocracy which then decays into oligarchy. The people overthrow the oligarchs, establish a popular government, but that descends into license, chaos. And then inevitably someone strong steps in and you're back to monarchy, a constant loop.
A loop of decline and temporary fixes. So what made Rome different? How did it break out of that cycle, at least for centuries? He says Rome got great because of its internal fights, not despite them.
And this is where Machiavelli gets really counterintuitive and, frankly, brilliant. Unlike his own Florence, which was constantly torn apart by factions, he argues Rome's tumults, the clashes between the common people, the plebeians, and the Senate, the nobles, were actually the source of its strength and its liberty.
Wow, that sounds like chaos.
Because those struggles, those noisy, messy conflicts, they forced compromises. They led to good laws and crucial institutions. The perfect example is the creation of the tribunes of the people. They were established specifically because the commons were agitated, and they became the guardians of Roman freedom against the Senate's power. The tension wasn't suppressed, it was channeled.
So the conflict itself wasn't the issue. It was having the right political structures to manage it. That was the key Rome found.
Precisely. Other cities lack those safety valves, those ways to turn popular discontent into political outcomes. And he makes a really strong case for who should guard liberty.
Yeah, who did he trust more, the nobles or the common people?
He argues it's safer in the hands of the commons, the many. His reasoning: the fundamental desire of the common people is simply not to be dominated. They want to keep the freedom they have. The nobles, on the other hand, have a powerful desire to dominate. They're inherently more ambitious and thus more likely to try and seize power for themselves. So giving guardianship to the people aligns it with the group least likely to destroy it.
That's a powerful argument. He contrasts Rome with places like Venice and Sparta, right? How are they different?
Yeah, Venice and Sparta managed stability for long periods, but they did it differently. They had less internal conflict, partly because they weren't as expansionist as Rome. Venice, for instance, had a large nobility, relatively speaking, and focused more inward. They didn't need to empower the common people as much for military strength.
Ah, because Rome had to expand.
Exactly. Rome's ambition, its need to conquer, meant it needed soldiers, lots of them. And that meant involving the plebeians, giving them a stake in the state, which naturally led to those internal tensions. Machiavelli's takeaway is, if a republic wants to grow, to be like Rome, it has to allow for and manage this kind of internal dissension and popular power. If you just want stability and are happy staying small, maybe the Venice or Sparta model works, but you sacrifice growth.
That links right back to his military ideas. You need the people involved to have strong soldiers.
Absolutely. The sinews of war, as he calls them. It all connects.
Now, speaking of foundations, Machiavelli seems pretty secular in his analysis most of the time, but he still saw a really important role for religion, didn't he?
Oh, definitely. He called it essential to the maintenance of civil society. But crucially, he wasn't talking about its truth value, like spiritually. He was focused on its practical utility.
How so?
He praises Numa Pompilius, the king after Romulus, for instilling a strong fear of the gods in the Romans. Why? Because it made people more obedient, more willing to follow leaders, easier to command in armies, more likely to keep oaths. It basically made governing easier.
So religion as a kind of social glue, a control mechanism.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
He saw the Romans using it masterfully. They used auspices, oaths, religious rites to legitimize institutions, motivate troops, even stop riots. And they were pragmatic about it. They, interpret the signs to fit their needs. But they always showed respect for religion publicly, and they harshly punished anyone who openly disrespected it because they understood its power as a civic force.
But then he turns around and has this really sharp critique of the church in his own time, in Italy.
Scathing, really.
Yeah.
He blames the contemporary Roman Church for two huge problems. First, he says it's made Italians wicked and irreligious through its own bad example. but the bigger political crime in his view.
Keeping Italy divided.
Exactly. He argues the church actively prevented Italy from uniting under a single king or republic, unlike France or Spain, which had unified. This division, he says flatly, is the reason for Italy's weakness and suffering. It's a purely political condemnation.
Wow. So even religion is analyzed purely for its effect on state power and stability.
That's Machiavelli. Everything comes back to political reality.
Okay, let's drill down into some of the specific mechanics he observed inside a state. He talks about the difference between the right to accuse someone formally and just. Slander.
Calumny.
Yeah, this is vital for a healthy republic, he thinks. Having established lawful ways to publicly accuse citizens like the tribunes bringing charges against Coriolanus is usable. It gives an outlet for grievances, a way to deal with potential threats through the system.
Keeps things sort of out in the open and regulated. Right. Calumny, on the other hand, just spreading rumors, lies, slander, is totally destructive. It bypasses any legal process, creates hatred, divides people, and can ruin innocent citizens and destabilize the whole state. He saw this as a huge issue in Florence, which he felt lacked good procedures for formal accusation and punishing slanderers, so rumors just ran wild.
So a healthy state needs a formal system for airing grievances, not just letting whispers poison everything. What about concentrated authority? Like the Roman dictatorship. Sounds dangerous.
You'd think so, but Machiavelli actually defends the Roman dictatorship. He argues it did good, not harm. The key difference, he says, was how it was set up.
How so?
It was granted by a free vote of the people. It was for a specific, limited purpose, usually a military crisis. And crucially, it was for a short, fixed term. It was a temporary legal concentration of power for emergencies, not a permanent grab.
So the danger wasn't the power itself, but how it was given and for how long.
Exactly. The powers that were dangerous were the ones usurped illegally or granted without clear limits, especially for long periods. His go-to negative example is the decemvirate. Again, they were given power for a year, other offices were suspended, and it became tyranny because those critical limits weren't there or were ignored. It's about the constraints.
Makes sense. He also has some practical tips for rulers, like about giving out benefits or making promises.
Yeah, pretty straightforward advice, but often ignored, he implies. Don't wait until you're in deep trouble to start handing out favors or benefits to win people over.
Too little, too late.
Right. By then, people see it as desperation, not genuine goodwill, and it probably won't save you anyway. He contrasts the Roman Senate cleverly giving benefits to the commons when the enemy persona was at the gates, which worked with princes who try the same thing when they're already cornered and usually fail.
And what about promises made under pressure, like if you're captured in war?
He argues they aren't really binding, especially if keeping them harms the public good. He uses the example of the Roman consuls trapped at the Caudine Forks. They made terms to save the army, but back in Rome, Postumius argued the Senate wasn't bound because the promise was forced and against Rome's interests. Machiavelli notes that both princes and republics will break faith when driven by fear. Fear trumps promises.
Fear again seems like a core motivator in his world. What about dealing with a growing problem within the state, like a powerful citizen getting too influential? Attack it head on.
Not always. He suggests that when a mischief like that is developing, sometimes it's actually safer to temporize, to kind of play for time, rather than launching a violent crackdown too early.
Why? Wouldn't you want to nip it in the bud?
Because a premature attack might just backfire and consolidate the person's power. He uses Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. His enemies exiled him, thinking they'd destroyed him, but it just rallied his supporters, and he came back even stronger, basically as the ruler. Caesar's enemies, on the other hand, waited too long. It's a judgment call about timing and power. Confronting too early can precipitate the very thing you fear.
That's tricky. It's about reading the situation very carefully.
Extremely carefully.
And how do people, and maybe states too, make judgments? He noticed a difference between thinking abstractly and dealing with concrete situations.
Yeah, this is interesting. He observes that people often make mistakes when judging things in general terms, in the abstract. But when they're faced with specific choices, specific people, they often see things more clearly.
Like the Roman commons.
Exactly. They fought tooth and nail for the principle of electing commoners, plebeians, as tribunes. But when it came to the actual vote, they often chose nobles, recognizing the specific qualities and experience of those individuals. Similarly, he says Florentines complained endlessly about general disorder, blaming this person or that person. But when some of them actually got involved in governing, they realized the problems were deeper, more systemic, not just about individuals.
So getting your hands dirty makes you see things differently than theorizing from afar.
Pretty much. Facing the particulars often exposes the flaws in our general ideas, and he notes that republics, especially weaker ones, often struggle with making hard choices, tending to be driven by immediate necessity rather than clear, proactive decisions.
Let's switch to the military. Obviously, huge for Rome and a big focus for Machiavelli. He had that famous line about the sinews of war not being money. What did he mean?
He meant good soldiers, loyal, trained soldiers from your own population. He argues flat out that an army without its own capable troops is useless, no matter how much money you throw at it. He points to Roman history, like Tullus finding no trained men after a long peace. His core message: cities, princes must train their own people. Relying on mercenaries or auxiliary troops, it's a recipe for disaster because their loyalty and motivation are always questionable.
Your own people fight for their own homes. Makes sense. What about where to fight? On your own turf or take the war to the enemy?
His answer is, it depends entirely on your state. Are your people experienced in war? Is your country armed and ready, like Rome was against Hannibal? Then, he says, wait for the attack on your own frontier. You can resupply easily. Your soldiers know the terrain, the core of your state is defended.
But if you're not like that?
If your people are unarmed, your country isn't used to war like Hannibal advising King Antiochus, then you absolutely must carry the war far away from home. Keep the fighting away from your vulnerable core. Protect the homeland at all costs by fighting elsewhere.
So the strategy flows directly from your internal condition and preparedness.
Absolutely. Know thyself, basically.
Infantry versus cavalry. Where did Machiavelli land on that?
He strongly favored infantry. He saw foot soldiers as the more reliable, decisive element in battle. He uses Roman victories as proof, and examples like the Swiss infantry beating cavalry under Carmignola. Cavalry has its uses for sure, scouting, pursuing, but the solid, disciplined infantry formation was the key to winning battles in his analysis.
And artillery. That was the big new technology in his day. Did he think it changed everything?
He was actually surprisingly skeptical about its impact on the actual battlefield. He saw it as very useful for sieges knocking down walls. But in open battle, he argued it didn't stop determined infantry charges, didn't make close combat obsolete, and certainly didn't replace the need for good old-fashioned courage and discipline. It was a factor, yes, but not the game changer some thought. Ancient principles still held.
So discipline and training are still paramount, regardless of technology.
Absolutely essential. A great captain needs trained soldiers. Throwing untrained men into battle is just asking for defeat. He talks about commanders like Camillus rallying disciplined troops, or Gracchus taking raw recruits and drilling them into an effective force. He even compares military training to hunting, learning terrain, adapting, becoming tough.
What about a specific military practice he thought was really bad for a republic like Rome, led to its downfall even?
Prolonged military commands, giving individual citizens command over armies for years and years on end.
Like Marius, Sulla, Caesar?
Exactly. He saw this as fatal. It allowed these commanders to build up personal loyalty among their troops, creating private armies that became more powerful than the state itself. Eventually, these generals turned their armies on Rome. Republics, he warned, must avoid letting individuals gain that kind of long-term, concentrated military power. Rotate commands frequently.
And how should you hold on to cities you've conquered? The Romans didn't seem keen on building big fortresses inside those cities.
Right. Machiavelli thought building fortresses in subject cities to control the population was actually mischievous, counterproductive. Why? It breeds resentment, relies on force instead of trying to win goodwill, and the fortress could even be captured and used against you. The Romans, he argued, relied more on their own strong field army for external defense, and, ideally, on cultivating some level of acceptance or goodwill among the conquered people. That was a more secure hold, in his view, than stone walls inside the city.
Interesting.
He also warned against dividing subject cities into factions to rule them. That just tends to infect your own state with the same divisions, like he saw happen between Florence and Pistoia.
So rely on your own strength and maybe the consent, or at least the quiet acceptance of the governed, not on building cages for them.
That was his reading of the Roman approach, yeah.
Yeah.
He uses examples like Madonna Caterina Sforza losing her fortress because she didn't have the people's support. The building itself didn't save her.
Let's shift to leadership itself and how citizens act within the state. What makes a great military leader? Is it more about the general or the army they lead?
He kind of wrestles with this. Livy seemed to imply that captain was more important. Machiavelli leans that way too, suggesting it's often easier for a really good captain to make a good army out of average soldiers than for a good army to succeed under a weak captain. He quotes Caesar's famous line about going against a captain without an army, Pompey, and coming back against an army without a captain. It highlights leadership's power to shape the human material.
The leader as the crucial variable. What about leadership style? Severe or gentle? He brings up Manlius Torquatus executing his own son for disobedience versus Valerius Corvinus being known for his humanity.
And his conclusion is interesting. In the Roman context, both styles could work. Manlius's absolute severity enforced discipline and earned respect in a harsh way. Valerius's gentleness and rapport with his soldiers also built loyalty and effectiveness. So different paths could lead to glory and a well-run army, depending on the leader's personality and maybe the specific times.
But there was one thing that never worked.
Right. Excessive pride, arrogance, haughtiness. That was always hated and detrimental, regardless of whether you were generally severe or gentle. No one likes an arrogant leader.
Okay, so flexibility and method, but humility is key. How should influential citizens behave in a republic? How should they gain their influence?
This is crucial for a healthy republic. Their reputation, their credit, should come from public service, from open, lawful actions that benefit the state. It should not come from secret deals, distributing private favors, or backroom maneuvering.
Why the distinction?
Because influence gained secretly or through favors creates private power bases that aren't accountable. It leads to a dangerous situation where powerful citizens might become so influential that even the elected magistrates are afraid to cross them. True reputation serves the public. This hidden influence serves private ambition. He also notes, kind of cynically, that a great man has an easier path if fortune removes his rivals. Otherwise, he has to actively plot and scheme to overcome them.
It's about transparent contribution versus hidden manipulation.
Exactly. Public good versus private power networks.
What about envy? You mentioned Florence being torn apart. Machiavelli saw envy as a major political force, right?
A hugely destructive one. He believed envy within the state could paralyze decision-making, prevent effective action against enemies, and create bitter divisions. He even suggests, rather grimly, that sometimes the only cure for the gridlock caused by intense envy between powerful figures is, well, for one of them to die.
Wow, that's dark.
It is. He points to examples like Roman campaigns being delayed by internal jealousies, Savonarola being undermined by his envious rivals in Florence, or Piero Soderini, Florence's leader, whose gentle approach failed because he couldn't overcome the envy directed at him. His practical advice: when defending a city, don't arm an undisciplined, envious mob. Arm selected, reliable men.
So envy isn't just a personal feeling, it's a political poison that can cripple a state.
It can literally stop the state from defending itself.
Okay, lastly on these internal dynamics, conspiracies. Always dramatic stuff. What were Machiavelli's insights there?
He saw them as incredibly risky, especially for princes. He states flatly that more rulers die from plots than from open war.
So how do you avoid them?
The number one way: avoid being hated by the general public. Widespread hatred makes plots much easier, but he makes a really sharp point about targeted offenses against specific individuals. You're actually in more danger from people you've previously favored and promoted than from those you've openly wronged.
Wait, why? That seems counterintuitive.
Because the ones you favored have access, they have opportunity. They're inside the circle. The person you've wronged might hate you, but they probably lack the means to get close enough to strike. The disgruntled insider is the bigger threat.
Ah, that's a chilling thought. What about conspiracies against the state itself, against one's country?
He thinks they're actually less dangerous in the planning stages, because you can often operate more secretly when trying to overthrow a republic or seize power. But in the actual execution phase, just as risky, if not more so, than plotting against a single prince. One tiny mistake, one leak, one unforeseen event, and it all falls apart. Success requires near perfection. Failure usually means death.
It really sounds like he's writing a survival manual for a very dangerous game, whether you're the ruler or the one plotting against them.
That's a good way to put it. It's a very cold, hard look at the practical realities and risks of political life.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit now and touch on Machiavelli's broader view of history itself. He noticed some recurring patterns, didn't he?
He did. He observed that similar events, similar accidents, as he sometimes calls them, seem to happen again and again in different places and times. History repeats, or at least rhymes. He also had this idea that collective memory is quite fragile.
How so?
He believed that major changes like the rise of a new religion, changes in language, or huge natural disasters like floods or plagues could effectively wipe out the memory of the past. This makes studying history, like the history of Rome that had survived, absolutely critical.
It's how we recover those lost lessons, lessons about problems we might think are totally new but really aren't.
And he drew a contrast between ancient societies and his own time, particularly concerning freedom.
Yeah, he kind of lamented what he saw as a decline. He looked back at ancient peoples like the Greeks and saw this fierce, almost violent love for liberty. They took terrible revenge when their freedom was lost. He felt that many people in his own time, perhaps influenced by certain ways of interpreting Christianity, valued patience, humility, maybe even ease over the kind of active valor needed to fight for and defend freedom. This made them, in his view, more susceptible to tyranny.
And he even blames the Roman Empire itself for contributing to that decline.
In a way, yes. He argues that as Rome built its massive empire, it destroyed countless smaller free cities and republics across the Mediterranean world. So paradoxically, the very success of the Roman Empire ended up extinguishing many of the existing examples of passionate love for freedom.
That's ironic. He also had that really interesting, almost cyclical idea about the total amount of good and evil in the world.
Yeah, this is fascinating. He suggests that the overall quantity of good and evil in the world remains roughly constant. It doesn't really increase or decrease overall. Instead, it just shifts about from one country to another. Virtue might flourish here while corruption reigns there, and then later the situation might reverse.
So human nature doesn't fundamentally change. The potential for good and evil is always there, but where it manifests most strongly changes over time and place.
That seems to be the idea. It's not about overall progress or decline for humanity, but about the changing fortunes and characters of specific nations or regions.
That's a really provocative thought, that this balance isn't fixed, it moves around. And finally, what about his own stance on praising the past versus the present? Was he just being nostalgic?
He acknowledges that tendency, especially in older people, to romanticize the past because, their own youth is gone, their desires have changed. So some of it is subjective bias. But he also argues that sometimes the corruption and decay of the present are just so obvious, so undeniable, that praising the relative virtue of the past is entirely justified. It's not just nostalgia, it's a realistic assessment.
So a bit of psychological insight mixed with his usual dose of hard-headed realism about his own era.
Yeah, that feels very Machiavelli, always observing human psychology, but grounding it firmly in political reality.
Wow. We have really covered a lot of ground here, digging deep into Machiavelli's take on ancient Rome, all based on the sources you brought. We've looked at how states start, his challenging views on human nature, the cycles of government, Rome's unique path, the role of religion as a tool, those nitty-gritty internal dynamics like accusation and authority, and his really sharp insights on war and leadership.
And it's so clear reading him that these weren't just, dusty historical observations for him. He genuinely believed Rome's story held timeless lessons, warnings, blueprints, really, for any political society. Insights he desperately wanted people in his time and maybe future times to understand.
And that's the real power of this kind of deep dive, isn't it? It's a way to access these potent ideas about states, power, and human behavior that Machiavelli spent so much effort extracting from Rome's long history.
Absolutely. He did the hard work of analysis for us, in a sense.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on after this discussion. If Machiavelli is right, or even partly right, that history shows this sort of constant amount of good and evil just shifting around the globe, what does that idea that human nature and these political forces are relatively fixed suggest about the challenges and possibilities we face now in our own time?
Does understanding these historical patterns, these Roman examples filtered through Machiavelli, actually give us any leverage, any power to influence where that balance between, say, freedom and tyranny or virtue and corruption lies today?
A big question. Definitely one worth wrestling with.
It really is.
Thank you so much for sharing these fantastic sources for our deep dive today. It's been fascinating exploring them with you.